Putin is likely waiting on China to make their move on Taiwan. My assessment is that's likely to happen in the spring. We had the Deputy Commanding General of the 101st Airborne Division conducting joint military exercises just a few miles from the Ukrainian border. This is one of the most disturbing developments that I've seen more than anything else. That is a trigger for a Russian nuclear escalation. This month will be the turning point of the war. We've been crossing Russia's red lines for the past 8 months. It's just a matter of time before they respond with a massive attack, and I think it's going to end very badly for us.
Effectively, right now, we would lose a nuclear war, is what you're saying.
We would absolutely lose a nuclear war with Russia or China. There's no question in my mind about that.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel we have back again Deputy Director of National Operations of the EMP Task Force and Homeland Security, former U.S. Army Headquarters staff officer, and a published national security strategist and military historian, and it's safe to say a Russia and nuclear weapons expert. The last time we spoke with David Pyne, it was the day after Nord Stream was attacked. And a lot has transpired since then. The basis of our talk today is an article that you just wrote on your Substack, which I would encourage people to go and check out. I'll post a link to that in the description below. But what is your assessment of what's going on with the war?
Well, I mean, short term, Ukraine has had the momentum. They've been taking back additional territory from Russia, which Russia recently annexed back in late September. And that's exactly what we don't want to have happen, because that kind of situation where Ukraine is taking back Russian-annexed territory is pretty much what some Russian leaders have warned could result in a Russian nuclear escalation. I think we've discussed it in your previous show. I assess that probably the most likely Russian nuclear attack we would see in Ukraine would likely be some kind of low yield nuclear airburst over Kyiv that wouldn't necessarily kill very many people at all, but it would essentially be a super EMP attack, which would take out all communications and essentially make Kyiv ungovernable from a Ukrainian government perspective, for potentially forcing the Ukrainian government and military headquarters to relocate to a Western Ukrainian city. In terms of the likelihood, I agree with Rebecca Koffler, who's a retired senior DIA agent who wrote a great book entitled Putin's Playbook and his plan to defeat the U.S. And her assessment currently is about 30% risk of Russian nuclear escalation. Before that occurs, she stated that most likely we would see some kind of massive cyber attack or minimally a space warfare attack in which Russia took down, U.S. and NATO satellites. Even just that kind of cyber attack or an ASAT attack against our satellites, our GPS and early warning satellites would blind us. Would make our ability to coordinate military responses or even detect incoming attacks, almost non-existent. And so I think that'd be probably the first move we would see. One of my the folks I work with, Bob McEntee, who works as our Utah EMP Task Force Director, has assessed that in the war games that he served in the U.S. Air Force as a nuclear war planner. He said all of the Air Force war games when he served, U.S. satellites were down within 6 hours of the war. So I think it could likely even be shorter than that, since it's been a while since he left the Air Force.
So you think, and I'll try to play a little bit of the devil's advocate, because I know there's probably people who are very supportive of the Ukrainian war effort, but you are saying that there would be a targeting of NATO intel information infrastructure prior to any sort of use of tactical weapons. So you feel that the attack would be, or at least the person you quoted, the attack would be on NATO as opposed to Ukraine, that we would see that escalatory ladder, that step take place before that?
That's essentially Russian doctrine, is to escalate through a series of runs. They have escalation dominance in a number of fields, including cyber, space warfare, EMP, and nuclear warfare. Obviously, strategic nuclear is the last run of the escalation ladder, and tactical nuclear is the second to last. So in a general war with NATO, that's how they would fight. They would use cyber first, then perhaps escalate to EMP, and then move to tactical nuclear. It's obviously a little different situation where we have this proxy war that NATO is fighting against Russia and Ukraine. And the reason that a space warfare attack on U.S. and NATO satellites would be more likely is because the U.S. has done so much to provoke Russia to attack us, and they haven't done so yet. It's been one of the most surprising things coming from my standpoint is that Putin has shown tremendous patience, and he has not been provoked into responding with his Russia's massive cyber, EMP, and nuclear capabilities. I was predicting for some months that Russia would stage a massive cyber attack against us in response to what we've actually admitted are cyber offensive attacks against Russia itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's safe to say that there's a bit of an economic war going on as well, and I think there's some 4D chess being played there with respect to the dissolution of NATO. If Russia can cause infighting amongst NATO, you could say that that's a success in of itself, if you can kill your enemy from the inside out, so to speak. But what about people who might say, people who are of the belief that the Ukrainians have the right to fight for their country and take back the annexed territories, even though it might lead to nuclear escalation? How do we reconcile those two things?
Well, I mean, we have a tremendous cognitive dissonance, certainly at the level, in the Pentagon and in the Biden administration, in which they somehow assess that we can, wage this undeclared war against Russia, a proxy war in Ukraine, give them essentially, we have hundreds of troops, special operations troops in Ukraine that are essentially training them on U.S. heavy weapon systems, HIMARS and whatnot, and then helping them decide which Russian targets to destroy. And, that's essentially been admitted multiple times, whether it's, in terms of the Russian flagship that was Black Sea flagship that we helped them destroy, and various other targets, or even just taking out Russian generals. We've taken out over a dozen Russian general officers, essentially giving Ukraine the actionable intelligence, and they pulled the trigger. And so essentially the U.S. is in many ways, I would argue, essentially a belligerent in the conflict. And I mean, this is just, Russia hasn't responded yet in kind, but I can guarantee you they have plans to do so. There's a lot of, questions in terms of why haven't they done more? Why haven't they engaged in massive cyber attacks against us? I mean, certainly we did see an 800% increase in Russian cyber attacks on the U.S. in the first day of the invasion. But I tend to think that Putin is likely thinking, kind of waiting on China to make their move on Taiwan. Certainly, they had a lot of meetings to coordinate their plans in terms of when China is currently planning on attacking, blockading, and invading Taiwan. My assessment is that's likely to happen in the spring. But there's a lot of people that believe that China is actually unhappy with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, there's evidence that Chinese President Xi actually told Putin that he wanted to see Russia escalate the war in Ukraine and conduct this, no limits full mobilization. Russia has so far mobilized about, 381,000 troops. It remains to be seen whether they'll actually fall through with a mobilization of over a million men, as some Russian sources were claiming. But whether they do or not will determine, I think, whether they decide to use nuclear weapons. Because if we don't agree to negotiate a peace agreement with Russia, or kind of pressure Ukraine to do the same, then I think Russia will have no choice other than either mobilizing over a million men to occupy and perhaps annex most of, if not all of Ukraine, or else to use nuclear weapons or possibly cyber EMP weapons that they could use to win the war within a week.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit more about all of the specific weapons that they might use, because there's a lot of flippancy around what the Russian capabilities are with that. I think there's a lot of people who brush it off as if it's no big deal because they watch videos of, the Russians making errors on the battlefield today, and they presume that, or they extrapolate that to their strategic forces. And you're going to talk today about why, that may be very misguided, because they do allocate a significant amount of their military budgets to working on their strategic forces and their research and development in that. Maybe first, what about this idea that Russia is running out of weapons? What do you make of that? Because that's been something, an ongoing narrative since the beginning of this thing. Oh, Russia's going to run out of weapons any day now. What is your assessment of that? Because we know, they're using a lot of the loitering munitions now. Are they just utilizing those because they're more effective, or is it because they're running out of stuff?
Well, I think that we need to understand here in the West that 80% of what we hear from our liberal mainstream media sources are likely 80% disinformation from Ukraine. War propaganda. Obviously, both the U.S. and Canada are led by fervently anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian leaders. I'm pro-Ukrainian. I'm anti-Russian, but I think it's important that we try to find a peace agreement, negotiate a peace agreement, and kind of end the conflict with Russia. So I don't think that Russia is running out of weapons. I think we've really underestimated the number of missiles and rockets that they have. They have tremendous amounts of short range and medium range ballistic and cruise missiles. I do think that Putin has made a tremendous number of mistakes in fighting the war, primarily in terms of making it a special military operation. We previously discussed that he's forced Russian forces to fight outnumbered on the battlefield by Ukrainian forces by about 3-1. This mobilization order will certainly change that. There's so many things that he could have done. Even GPS jammers, Russian GPS jammers haven't been utilized enough, but primarily in terms of taking out Ukrainian satellites and communications and power. And at the beginning of the war, there were all these 3- and 4-star generals here on Fox News that stated their estimates that Kyiv would fall within 3 days and Ukraine would fall within 3 weeks. It was all conditioned upon the Russian use of massive cyber capabilities, which are I assess them to be the best in the world. They've obviously focused a lot on hitting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. I think by some reports, over half of critical infrastructure has been destroyed or disabled, according to Ukrainian government sources. So I think we'll see a lot more of that to kind of make life difficult for the Ukrainian population without actually targeting them for death or destruction. Russia's been quite good about that in terms of trying to limit Ukrainian civilian casualties. Perhaps in the hopes that eventually they'll come around and try to get rid of Zelensky, which is unlikely. But certainly, I would say that Zelensky has been a terrible leader for Ukraine and is pursuing policies that could very well lead to its destruction.
I agree. So, with respect to in your article, you talked about, and I don't know if this is your theory, but that the Russians had been positioning Iskander short-range ballistic missiles around the Kherson area. Right now, we know that there's a big battle coming there, which by some people's accounts is going to be like the Stalingrad moment for this conflict, the turning point potentially in either direction. Is that true that they've deployed these short-range ballistic missiles to Kherson that potentially have a nuclear capability?
Yeah, from the onset of the conflict, they've deployed nuclear-capable systems. I mean, we have to understand that unlike the U.S., which has pretty much eliminated most of our non-strategic or tactical nuclear capabilities, Russian nuclear capabilities in the tactical area are vast. They have about 5,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons, and they're deployed mostly in missiles, but also in terms of nuclear-capable artillery. The 2S4 and 2S7 8-inch artillery system, 203 millimeter artillery system, and then the 240 millimeter mortar Those are self-propelled, but have nuclear capabilities. And then, as you mentioned, Iskander and various other dual-use nuclear capabilities, such as the Kinzhal and other weapons. So they've had a capability in Ukraine almost from the onset of the war. So it's hard to assess that their deployment of dual capable nuclear short-range ballistic missiles is a definitive signal that they're about to engage in a nuclear escalation in Ukraine. But it certainly is a sign that they're keeping their options open. It may also be meant as kind of signaling to Ukraine and the West that they're very serious about potentially using nuclear weapons. And the Biden administration has reportedly actually admitted to talking to top Russian defense ministry and national security officials to try to dissuade them from using Russian nuclear weapons, because we did receive reports that top Russian military leaders were actually discussing nuclear employment options against Ukraine.
What do you think the outcome of this Kherson situation is going to be? Because there's all kinds of narratives as to what's going on with the bridge and the dam and the evacuation, and whether or not the Russians are trying to bait the Ukrainians into a fight that they can't win. And do you think that this is going to be a pivotal moment? What do you think the outcome is going to be? And do you think a potential nuclear weapon could be deployed here?
Well, what's really interesting is that Putin has ordered the evacuation, the civilian evacuation of Kherson City, which is almost kind of on the fairly northern reaches of Russian-controlled territory in Kherson Oblast, on the north side of the Dnieper River. And there's been a lot of discussion that Russia might be preparing a general evacuation of all the territory north of the river. I have read sources that say Ukraine is saying that it's a trap that Russia's setting for them, that somehow they're it's unclear to me whether that's the case or not. But I think that this month will be the turning point of the war that will shift the momentum back to the Russians, because I think that Ukrainian forces are running out, they're running low on troops. At the same time, the Russian forces are being reinforced by hundreds of thousands of newly mobilized reservists. And as well, we know that the November rains occur, kind of mid to late month. So within a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, we'll see a lot of rain that will create muddy conditions that will favor the defender, and that will bring a halt to the Ukrainian offensive. So I'm not of the belief that I don't think Ukraine will capture a lot more territory this month.
And what do you think the utility is of these HIMARS? Because the Russians or the Americans are saying that the Ukrainians haven't lost one HIMARS system. They've shot down many of the missiles the Russians have, but they haven't been able to take out one HIMARS systems. Now, those same sources claim that the Russians haven't shot down any HIMARS either, which we almost know for a fact is untrue, because of course there's many bridges and critical assets that are still there, which could have been blown up a long time ago with these HIMARS systems. But how effective do you think these are, and are they changing the game for Ukraine? Because it seems like they must be doing something, and if they're as good as they say they are, then why aren't they deploying more of these things?
Well, we've only provided the Ukrainians with a limited number of HIMARS systems, and we haven't provided the long-range versions. The ones that we provided, I think, have perhaps a range of 45 to 50 miles. So it's a pretty good range, but not really a long range enough, for example, to hit Sevastopol from Ukrainian territory, or any major Russian targets such as the Kerch Bridge. They are making a difference, particularly in terms of like counter battery fire, when in terms of attacking Russian artillery, which certainly previous to the introduction of the HIMARS and continuing to today, Russia has a very major advantage over the Ukrainians in terms of artillery systems and rocket systems, which they've used to devastating effect to maximize a lot of Ukrainian casualties during this stage of the conflict.
So if they are effective, and I'm not sure if you believe that they haven't lost any of these systems. I mean, if they've only provided, what, like 16 or something, I think, somewhere between 16 and 24, and if they're still using them, then the shoot and scoot strategy must be working. And if that's the case, then why wouldn't they just double the order? And, because it would appear then that that's a testament to the American technological superiority over Russians in that respect anyways. So why wouldn't they be deploying more of these things? Like, I don't understand. If it's so effective, why aren't they using more?
Well, I think that the reports that you're referring to are false. I think that certainly the Russians have shot down a lot of the Ukrainian HIMARS artillery salvos, rocket salvos, and likely destroyed a few HIMARS systems as well. I don't know what the exact estimates are in terms of HIMARS losses. And certainly Biden is talking about another 50 billion as he faces the likelihood of losing control of Congress from Democrat control in tonight's elections or today's elections. He's talking about during the lame duck congressional session, passing an additional 50 billion before the Republicans take control. And so that package, I haven't seen a breakdown of what the package would include. Typically, it's included about 50% of our aid to Ukraine. 70 billion thus far has been economic, and then the other half has been military. But I would think that given the massive size of that aid package, that we would likely double our HIMARS weapon systems deliveries in the next few months.
Do you think,
assuming it passes?
Yeah, I probably should save this question for later, but I personally question whether or not a change in the congressional outcomes will lead to any significant foreign policy change. You may differ in your perspective, but there's a lot of people who think that it's just going to be more of the same. What do you think about that?
So I think Republicans in recent polls, there's been anywhere from 52 to 48%, or let's see, 52 to 45%. Basically, about half of Republicans polled say they want a peaceful end to the war as soon as possible. They don't want to continue military aid if it's going to prolong the war. And then the other half pretty much say, they're neoconservatives that say that they want to continue military aid indefinitely, essentially, at least for the time being, to help Ukraine recapture lost territory. So in terms of congressional Republicans, certainly up to now, we've seen, Congress on the Republican side dominated by folks like McConnell and Lindsey Graham that are really gung-ho about, fighting Russia and Ukraine. But then, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy recently stated that there's not going to be any blank check for Ukraine anymore in terms of military aid. So I would assume that Republicans would continue to support a limited amount of military aid, but a growing number of Republicans, especially in the House, are gonna oppose it. So I think what we'll see is kind of a gradual wind down of military assistance to Ukraine over the course of the first 6 months of next year.
Yeah, I don't know if I am so convinced of that, just because I feel as though we're but one event away from, the situation coming back into the news, and then all of a sudden it becoming a national security issue, and there'll be a lot of pressure on people then to support more funding. But I guess we'll see how it plays out. Getting back to the ground in Ukraine, we have the 101st Airborne who's deployed on a apparent combat deployment along I believe they're in Romania, close to the Ukraine border, if I'm not mistaken. What is your interpretation of what they're going to be used for? Why are they there?
This is one of the most disturbing developments that I've seen in the last 5-6 weeks, is that we had the Deputy Commanding General of the 101st Airborne Division, which hasn't been deployed to Europe for since the end of World War II, conducting exercises, joint military exercises, just a few miles from the Ukrainian border, and openly stating that the mission is not a training mission, but it's a combat deployment, where they're ready to go in with hours notice to enter Western Ukraine. And essentially what's been said is their mission would likely be kind of a blocking mission, which they would perhaps take a position in Odessa, which the Russians have certainly expressed interest in capturing, in order to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, which they've mostly done thus far, especially with their blockade. But there's been the grain deal, which has gone back and forth, that has allowed for a significant lessening of the blockade. But that's a very disturbing development, because even if we were to enter, send troops into Ukraine on kind of a quote, he said, used the words combat deployment. It wasn't like we're just going to be there to help make sure the supplies arrive in a non-combat role. He said a combat deployment. So essentially what that means is, we would be entering the war on Ukraine's side with a direct U.S. military intervention. And that really is, more than anything else, that is kind of the trigger for Russian nuclear escalation. And obviously the same thing would happen in the event of, if we were to, Biden were to make good on his threats to defend Taiwan militarily, which he stated 4 times, basically providing strategic clarity that we'll go to war with China over Taiwan. These are creating two different simultaneous conflicts, in which either one could bring us into a nuclear EMP war with Russia and China combined, and then North Korea as well. Because in my assessment, the terms of the Sino-Russian alliance are essentially, if either party finds itself in direct conflict with the U.S., the other party will enter the war directly, and engage in attacks on U.S. military bases and perhaps the U.S. homeland itself.
Yeah, it's difficult to say whether or not what the Russian response would be, because we've heard them use the term like red line many times before with respect to the Crimean Bridge, and with respect to attacking critical infrastructure like Nord Stream. So they've attacked Nord Stream, they've attacked the bridge, and by they I mean obviously there's no official agreement upon who has done that yet, but I think we all know who did, or at least we know that it was perhaps not the Russians, we'll say. But they haven't seemingly escalated, at least not towards NATO directly. They've intensified their strikes on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, but they haven't crossed that line yet. So a part of me wonders if this airborne division slow creeps into Odessa, say, on a peacekeeping mission, would Russia immediately respond, or would there be? I guess my curiosity lies in, where are the Russians going to first engage NATO directly? Is it going to be an attack on critical infrastructure? Is it going to be, what do you think does look like? You said that it might be cyber attacks, that it might be attacking a satellite system. Do you think that there's a potential for attacks on critical infrastructure in NATO?
I do. Yeah, I think currently, I think the nuclear EMP threat on the U.S. and Canada are quite limited. But in terms of cyber, I think the risks of Russian cyber attack on the U.S. are fairly high. It could really come at any moment. The more provocations we do against Russia in terms of the U.S. and NATO, the more likely and that is going to occur in the near term. So I do think that's likely. And as I mentioned, I think that the first Russian move against NATO wouldn't be a direct military strike. I think it would be to take out our satellites in space, to blind us and essentially make us unable to coordinate our attacks, any effective military response against Russia, blinding us to attacks on the U.S. and NATO that are kinetic strikes, as well as make it difficult for us to even assess, what they're doing in Ukraine itself. So yeah, that would be the most likely move. But you raise a good point, because if we were to send the 101st Airborne Division on quote unquote a peacekeeping mission, which there was no total direct military mission to fight Russia, then it's conceivable that Putin might delay a direct military response. But the whole issue is, and this is, I was asked this question early in the war, what is Russia's red line? And the answer, obviously was NATO membership for Ukraine, number one, and number two, direct lethal military assistance to Ukraine. So we've been crossing Russia's red lines for the past 8.5 months, ever since the war began. And we've been crossing more and more of them. And it's just a matter of time before they respond with, a massive, comprehensive, cyber attack against the U.S. and Canada and NATO countries that could have the potential to destroy our country. So, there's not enough serious thinking that has been put into use by U.S. and NATO leaders as the potential ramifications, the serious and destructive ramifications of our policy of continuing to provoke Russia and to fight this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's going to end very badly for us unless we abandon it very quickly with supporting my ceasefire proposal.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a minute. You said that Russia has 2,500 advanced sub-kiloton nukes designed to create little fallout, ruling out any effect on their own country. So I think a lot of people, they get the idea that if they ever used one of the deterrents from using a tactical nuke would be the blowback effects. But apparently with these low-yield tactical nukes, they function just like a large conventional bomb, a very large conventional bomb. And thus they might be enticed to use it for this reason should this Ukrainian offensive actually gain steam. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, maybe we can go into the types of weapons that might be employed and how the nuclear escalation might unfold. So maybe you can explain to people a bit about these tactical nukes that Russia has and what their capabilities are and what the reality of that situation is.
Yeah, so Russia has a total of about 5,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, of which half are these advanced battlefield weapons that have yields between 0.1 and 1 kiloton. So in other words, 100 to 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent. And as you mentioned, as Peter Pyne brought to our attention before his unfortunate passing, he stated that all these 2,500 battlefield nuclear weapons are produce zero fallout. They're extremely advanced. They produce no fallout whatsoever. And so that's unheard of for a nuclear ground burst. Every quote unquote conventional nuclear weapon produces nuclear fallout. And so with these weapons, essentially, and admittedly, they're designed to fight NATO. And so it's unclear whether they would be used against Ukrainian forces in a tactical role. I think they would more likely be, the Russians would use them in a strategic role, for EMP type attacks, which would, essentially take out entire cities and, in terms of communications and power and internet and, make them unusable or, degrade the Ukrainian military's ability to defend those cities, potentially enabling the Russians to capture them. But they could be used. This could certainly be used by Russian forces in a tactical mode in which they're used against to destroy entire Ukrainian units, regiments, brigades, perhaps, and battalions to essentially, blow holes through the Ukrainian lines, destroy their strong points, and then enable Russian forces to, skirt around the devastated areas. with minimal risk of radioactive exposure.
Yeah, that's that's going to be news to a lot of people who have no idea that those things exist. And it's safe to say we have no equivalent in our arsenal.
We don't. So we have the only tactical nuclear weapons we currently have are the B-61 nuclear gravity bombs that were designed in 63. They were first produced in 1963, so they're ancient. Obviously, we have some that are upgraded. We recently upgraded a number of our B-61 gravity bombs in the 5 NATO countries where they're stationed to kind of what's called dial a yield, where they they have a yield perhaps between, let's say, 20 and 100 kilotons. Typically, tactical nuclear weapons are 50 kilotons and below, so perhaps it's 10 to 50. But our tactical nuclear weapons are really primitive. I mean, they're not mounted on hypersonic missiles like many of the Russian tactical nuclear weapons are. And we do have between 8 and 32 Trident II based tactical nuclear weapons with a yield of only 5 kilotons. I think that was a really foolish move on the part of the Trump administration to downgrade, replace a number of our strategic warheads on our Trident II missiles with tactical nuclear weapons. But those are essentially the only tactical nuclear weapons we would have in a war with China, because all of our 150 to 200 B-61 gravity bombs are located in Europe. Obviously, they could be redeployed, but I see no contingency plans to do so at this point.
And Peter Pry had estimated that, and you probably have a similar take, that if there was an all-out nuclear exchange that ensued, and a lot of people have misconceptions about the mutually assured destruction hypothesis in nuclear winter, that only 3% would actually die from the direct effects of nuclear exchange, but 90% would perish from second and third order effects. Can you maybe explain that a bit for people?
Yeah. So, first of all, the 90% estimate was the high end of the Congressional EAP Task Force's estimate of how many Americans would die following a comprehensive EMP first strike on the United States homeland. So it could be 50%. But I think it would likely be at the 70 to 90% end of the casualty estimates. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Dr. Pry believed that nuclear wars were survivable in the sense that Russian and Chinese nuclear weapons are not aimed against U.S. cities, as many U.S. leaders and citizens mistakenly believe. They're aimed at our nuclear and strategic forces. For example, our ICBM fields in 4 northern states would be the primary targets of the nuclear missile attack. There's also about a dozen nuclear storage facilities on U.S. military bases. Then there's 3 strategic nuclear bomber bases, and plus there's 2 nuclear submarine bases at Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington. So those would be the primary targets. Obviously, the first target, the most important target, would be Washington, D.C. So in the event of even the most limited nuclear attack from Russia or China, Washington, D.C. would be the first to be destroyed. And the Russians in particular have the capability to destroy, D.C. with perhaps as little as 3 to 5 minutes warning. It was just a few months ago that I was on a call with former Assistant Secretary of Defense Frank Gaffney, in which he reported that a Russian nuclear submarine had been sighted in Chesapeake Bay. And that's something we haven't seen since the Cold War. So they have the capability even to infiltrate nuclear missile submarines in Chesapeake Bay, where they could, just merely 100 miles perhaps from the capital.
That's insane. And we know that in the most recent nuclear posture review that the DoD released, they had altered their nuclear doctrine. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the significance of that?
I wouldn't say that we've really altered our nuclear doctrine. There was kind of a controversy within the Biden administration to whether we should move to a sole use nuclear doctrine. The sole use nuclear doctrine would mean that we would only use nuclear weapons if our enemies used nuclear weapons against one of the U.S. or its allies. So that was rejected. So what we have is there's actually two competing U.S. nuclear doctrines that are official. One is PDD 60, which replaces launch on warning, which what I refer to as launch on impact. And that essentially says that the U.S. would not launch its nuclear weapons until we would had absorbed the first nuclear impact. So we wouldn't absorb an entire nuclear first strike, but once we detected a nuclear detonation, a ground burst, or perhaps an air burst that was above a city, very close to a city that destroyed the city, we would only then would we launch back. In terms of our overall nuclear posture, we haven't really. We've never had a no first use nuclear posture. So essentially, in terms of our nuclear doctrine relating to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, we've never had a nuclear doctrine that says we can't use nukes in response to a conventional attack on the U.S. or its allies.
Okay. So there isn't much difference now than before?
No, I wouldn't say there is. But one thing that they did do to the detriment of U.S. national security is they canceled two important nuclear programs. One of those was the B-83 nuclear bomb, which, as Dr. Peter Price stated, is the only nuclear bomb we have in our arsenal, which can be used to potentially even destroy Russia's nuclear underground cities, nuclear command centers at Yamantau and Kozvinsky Mountain, which are the size of the DC Beltway. They can house 30,000 people each. Because this is our largest warhead. It was the only megaton yield size warhead that we have in our arsenal, and so they're getting rid of that. They're also getting rid of our what's called the SLICM-M, which is the Sea Launched Cruise Missile nuclear program, which was essentially reinstituting the nuclear tomahawks on our Navy ships. And that was an important program because it provided us with a much greater deterrence value, because currently the U.S. Navy only has 14 nuclear capable ships, or ships where nuclear missiles are mounted, and two of those are in retrofit. They're all nuclear missile submarines, and only 4 deployed at any time. With 2 in the Pacific and 2 in the Atlantic. And that doesn't provide a huge deterrent value, certainly not to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And the problem we have is that the most likely situation which we would have for an enemy nuclear escalation would be tactical nuclear weapons. And we're very weak in terms of our capabilities to respond to that. For me, the key is, pursuing a more offensive diplomatic strategy to prevent a nuclear war in the first place. But we have so many leaders that seem to think we can fight and win conventional wars against Russia and China without much threat of nuclear escalation. That mentality is completely false. And as you alluded to, U.S. leaders and most of our citizens believe that even if one nuclear weapon was used, it would automatically lead to a full nuclear exchange, which would destroy the world. And none of that's true. As I noted in my article, a Russian tactical nuclear weapon might only irradiate a few square miles and kill hundreds, not thousands of Ukrainians or Europeans. And so it's not automatically going to lead to a full-scale, nuclear exchange, unless, of course, we use nuclear weapons in response directly against Russia or Russian forces. The orders have already been given by President Xi Jinping to his military to prepare to attack and invade and reconquer Taiwan by the end of next year. I think it's really important for every American, every Canadian to prepare their families.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay